Shalom and good afternoon, good evening to our author, Howard, who is in Connecticut, and welcome to The Spy Who Knew Too Much. Our author series is sponsored by Congregation B'nai Shalom, the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center, Diablo Valley Hadassah, all in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. And I thank our authors always for their generosity of spirit and speaking for us because of the relationship with the Jewish Book Council without an honorarium. So we hope that you will all thank them by purchasing their book. This is a great read for people who like mysteries, people who like real life, true life stories, and spy thrillers. Some of the things that are said about Howard Blum's books, the New York Times, his books read like thrillers, though they are true life stories. He has a talent for uncovering history's most inexplicably forgotten stories, engrossing, highly engrossing, in fact, a page turner, etc., etc. And now a little bit about our author. I'm sorry if I'm going to read about it. Howard Blum is the author of the New York Times bestseller and the winner of the very prestigious Edgar Awards, American Lightning. He has also written The Gold of Exodus, Gangland, The Floor of Heaven, The Last Good Night, In the Enemy's House. And he was, which was the last one, a New York Times notable book. He has twice been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative reporting. As I've sort of mentioned a few times, he's coming to us from Connecticut. And for those who would like to ask questions, please use the chat function at the bottom of your computer screen, and we'll read them to him at the end of his formal presentation. And now, Howard, take it away.
Thank you. I've been writing books for a while now. At this stage of my career, I could fill a shelf, a small shelf with my various titles. But I've learned one thing in the course of writing all these books. Each book is its own battle. Each book brings with it its own specific challenges. And what I'd like to do this afternoon or evening here in Connecticut is share with you what I had to grapple with as I wrote The Spy Who Knew Too Much. I wrote the book in the room where you see me now, at this desk and at this computer. It's on a hilltop in Connecticut. It's a very bucolic place. I'm surrounded by old stone walls, open fields, then a forest. There's a pond outside of my window where I write. In the summer, you can hear the frogs croaking. Now it's iced over. There's a dusting of snow on the ground. As I said, it's a very pastoral, bucolic place, a pretty good place to write. Usually I can sit here all day and they're just not the normal, nothing more than the normal distractions that all of us have to deal with. You know, the call from the accountant talking in his voice of doom, that's something that a payment is due. And I imagine even Shakespeare at times had to put down his quill and take the children to soccer practice. So writing usually is a pretty easy discipline for me, especially in this setting. But writing The Spy Who Knew Too Much, I was caught up in something I couldn't avoid, I couldn't escape from, I couldn't hide away from on my hilltop. I was writing and researching my book in the midst of a pandemic. Now, I talk about researching my book. My books are all true stories. As was mentioned, I was a New York Times reporter for well over a decade, and I try to bring into my books, even though I tell stories, the standards of a Times news story. They have to be factually accurate, all the dates are right. If I quote someone, these have to be the actual quotes that I found in an interview or in a book or in a letter, and this requires a lot of work. The challenge of this book, I was dealing with spies, and spies don't really share secrets. They they steal them. And now I had to get spies to talk in the midst of a pandemic. So the rule usually is when you've got one of them to step forward, when you have an intelligence officer who wants to tell you something, you better go see him. And now in the early stages of this book, as I was doing my research, I had two intelligence officers who wanted to meet with me in Virginia. Usually, that's not a big deal. You hop on a plane, you stay in a hotel the night before, you get to see them as they wanted at 9 o'clock in the morning. But this was the early days of the pandemic. This was a time where you might remember what some people were talking seriously about ingesting bleach to deal with the viruses that were wafting through America. It was a time before we even had any belief that a vaccine could ever be created. It was a very scary time, but now I had to get myself to Virginia and meet with these two men, these two spies, if I wanted to do this book. So I didn't fly, I didn't stay in a hotel. I got up at 2 a.m. and drove the 7.5 hours down to Virginia to meet with these two intelligence officers. I get there and they've decided that they want to meet in a windowless conference room. And these guys are too macho to wear masks. Now, I've been in lots of scary situations. I've been on the front line in the war in Lebanon, in the Middle East. I've spent time with mafia hitmen, but I was never as fearful as I was talking to these two men without their masks in a windowless room in the early days of the pandemic. But I stuck with it for well over 6 hours. I remember going out of the room finally when the interviews was done. I had my pads filled with my notes, and I figured, well, this is it. I'm not going to survive to write this book. There was a Friendly's ice cream parlor right across the street from where I met with them, and I rushed inside. I figured, well, this is my last meal. I might as well get a hot fudge sundae. I hadn't had a hot fudge sundae since summer camp, but I went out that day and got one. That was the kind of challenges I had to deal with as I tried to research this book. But what I'd like to really focus on this afternoon is the challenges I faced while writing it. Remember, I had said that I write in a pretty isolated, idyllic place. Well, in the course of a pandemic, this isolation became claustrophobic. There was no way else I could go off my hilltop. I couldn't drive into New York to a restaurant. I couldn't go to a movie theater. We didn't see people. We were really cut off. And so each day, all I would have to do was sit down at this desk here at my computer and write. And that's a bit daunting, a bit intimidating. And I had to really psych myself up for this. And so what I thought I would do, what I needed to do, was to find a way that I could pull myself into the story, make it exciting for me. And I knew I had a pretty good story. I had researched a true life tale about a spy, a mole, who was embedded in our own intelligence service, but how to tell it. So for inspiration, I started reading some of the great spy novels. Yes, these were works of fiction, but I was going to take their narrative strategies and apply them to a true story. I would keep all the facts right, but I would try to do or aspire to do, what people like Jean le Carré or Ian Fleming had done in their spy tales. And the first thing I noticed is what they do is they have a character. They create a George Smiley or a James Bond, someone who will lead you through the action. It's what we call, when you write a movie script, the point of view, the POV, that will guide you through this entire yarn. And I needed someone who would be my main character to guide the reader through this story. And I had lots of possibilities. I had American agents, I had Russian agents, I had their children, their widows. Who could I find? And I finally settled on a man named Pete Bagley. I like Pete because of his character and his pedigree. Pete was the son of an admiral. His uncle was also an admiral. His brothers, both of them grew up to become the first siblings ever to wear admiral stars in the history of the U.S. Navy. His family has 7 ships named after them that are part of the U.S. fleet. But Pete, he had bad eyesight and he couldn't get into Annapolis. So he had to settle for Princeton. So Pete goes off to Princeton. He fights in the Korean War. And after that, he has to decide what to do with his life. He wanted to do something with public service. He was a patriot. So he goes to his uncle, the admiral, and his uncle picks up the phone and happens to call one of his good friends, who's now director of the new Central Intelligence Agency. And Pete gets a job as a spy. It was this sort of dedication, this sort of pedigree that made him attractive to me, and I hope would make him interesting to readers. But I was also drawn to Pete by the sort of daring do career he had. In the early days of the Cold War, he was stationed in Vienna. He worked in the back alleyways. He knew where all the bodies had been buried, and he'd even buried some of them. And just to give you a sense of what he was involved in, let me tell you about Operation Mozart Express. As I said, he was based in Vienna, and at early days of the Cold War, Vienna was a city occupied by 4 different armies. It was the American, the British, the French, and the Russian. And it was a very dangerous place, a city where bad things could happen. You could cross the street from the American side, and suddenly you find yourself in Russian territory. And once you stepped into the Russian territory, you could just disappear. That happened with great frequency. And in this city of Vienna, the American CIA headquarters received a visitor. It was a man who identified himself as a KGB major. And his name is not that important, really. But he announced that he wanted to defect. His name was Peter. That's what the CIA called him. And Peter said he wanted to bring secrets to America. He could tell them all about what the Russian KGB was doing. And they check him out and they decide, well, he's the real thing. We've got to get him to Langley. We've got to debrief him. We've got to find out what he knows. But the first problem is, how can you get him out of Vienna? Normally, you could fly him out. There's a small airport in the US zone, fly him over the Russian, French zones, the British zones, and get him someplace safe. But now, since he's such a high priority target, they're afraid the Russians will just shoot down the plane. And that would be a real, not just tragedy for the spy and the pilot, but it could start World War III. The same thing is putting this spy in the trunk of a car and driving him through the checkpoint. They figure that car will certainly be stopped by the Russians once it gets into the Russian zone. So that too could lead to death and an international incident. So my hero, Pete Begley, comes up with a plan. He wants to use something that's called the Mozart Express. That's a train that trails its way through Vienna, through the American zone, the French zone, and the Russian zone until it makes its way out of the city. And Pete decides that this plan has a lot of dangers. The Russians can stop the train once it gets into their zone. They could ask to look for papers. They could find the spy. But he's going to get around this. He puts the spy in a big wooden box, and he stamps on the box, farm machinery. He figures that's better than saying, top secret intelligence officer inside. So he puts the box on the train, and Pete's on the train watching it as the Mozart Express makes its way. He has his hand in his pocket of his coat where he has his revolver, and it's moving along slowly. It's making its way through the Russian zone, and suddenly it grinds to a halt. And just as Pete had seen in his worst fears, a Russian team comes on board, a team of Russian soldiers, and they ask Pete to see his papers. He's showing them his papers, and then they notice this big 5-foot tall box. and they're having a really good time. They're kicking and kicking the box, and Pete doesn't know if the Russian is going to pop out like a jack in the box, or if he's going to cry in pain, or if the Russians are going to start shooting. And he's playing all this out, and finally the Russians decide to leave, and Pete makes his way forward into the French zone and finally safety. 4 days later, Pete and this Russian are on a safe house in Maryland. And this is a safe house, just to give you an idea of the kind of strange world Pete's living in. This is a safe house run by a former professional baseball player who's now working for the CIA. That's Pete's world. And I thought, well, this is a pretty good guy. I can use him to guide readers through my tale. There's also something else that a hero of these spy tales need. He needs to be, if you look at James Bond movies, a really dashing guy. And Pete was, in reality, a very handsome man. He had a thatch of bushy blonde hair, bright blue eyes that fixed you like magnets, big smile. There's a front piece to my book, and you can see him leaning against the fence, and he looks like a Ralph Lauren ad come to life. So I thought, well, that would make a pretty good hero too. So now that I had my hero, I needed another element. All these books, these spy tales, have a central event that starts the story rolling and seems to resonate throughout the entire drama. And I had a real life one. It involved Pete in the days after the Kennedy assassination. In the weeks after the Kennedy assassination, Pete has been brought back to Langley, Virginia, and he's now in charge of a special CIA team of Russian specialists, largely, who are trying to decide just who was Lee Harvey Oswald. It's well known that he was living in the Soviet Union for many years. He had defected and then had come back to America. But the big question was, had the Russians sent him back? Had the Russians ordered him to kill President Kennedy? And if that could be proven, if that could be substantiated, well, then we were looking at World War III. We were looking at millions of deaths. So Pete was part of this team trying to figure out who Lee Harvey Oswald really was. And while he's doing this, an old case that he'd been involved in suddenly comes to the forefront. When he had been based in Geneva 6 months or so earlier, a KGB man had been working for the Russians as a guard at a disarmament conference. The KGB man's name was Yuri Nasenko. And Yuri comes to the CIA and says that he has a big problem. He's been running up bills at the bars in Geneva, flirting with the women. He owed a small fortune in money, and he had taken KGB funds to pay for this, and he wanted the Americans to help him out. So Pete was given this, had a meeting with the spy, and he paid his bar bills. Actually, you and I, the American taxpayers, paid his bar bills. But this Yuri now is sent back into Moscow, and he's going to be a double agent, someone working for the CIA, and Pete is going to be his handler. So about a year passes, and Pete hasn't heard a word from Yuri. He figures it was a bad investment. But now that he's back in Langley, Virginia, working on the Lee Harvey Oswald case, the CIA station in Geneva tells him that an ad has appeared in the classified section of the local paper. It's a bit of word code about a lost dog. And this is a signal that Yuri has been taught to put in the paper to announce that he wants a crash meeting. He's going to be in Geneva in 4 days. So now Pete has to hightail it to Geneva. He has to find out what was so important. Why does Yuri want to have a crash meeting? And there's been a prearranged protocol for this crash meeting. What they decided on before Yuri went back to Moscow is that when he got to Geneva, he'd look in the Geneva phone book, he'd go to the page that listed movie theaters, he'd go to the top of the page, and the first one alphabetically, that's where they would meet on the fourth day, right out in front at precisely 7:15. So Pete gets to Geneva, checks out the phone book, finds the address of the ABC cinema, and he gets there at 7:15. And before he gets there, Pete is wary. Is Yuri going to be a double? Is this a trap? Is someone going to be looking for him? You know, Pete had made a lot of enemies during his career. So he shows up at the cinema wearing a disguise. He has a hat pulled down low. He has a phony mustache. He's wearing glasses. His collar is turned up. But there is Yuri looking at his watch right by the ticket window like a man waiting for his date. But Pete still can't just wave to him and say, "Hi, Yuri." He doesn't know who else is looking there, who else is watching. So he has to do something that's called a brush pass. This is something you learn to do in spy school. You have to walk by someone without breaking stride, without anyone noticing. You have to stick something in their pocket. You have to deliver the message that way. It's really the precise opposite of pickpocketing someone. This time you're not taking something out, you're putting something in. And what Pete is putting in is the location of the safe house where they're going to meet. So he goes up to Yuri without breaking stride and successfully manages to get into Yuri's pocket a piece of paper with the location of the safe house. Half hour later, they're sitting in the safe house. Now, it's in a fancy section of Geneva, very nice apartment. And there's a certain etiquette to safe house hospitality. You put out some food, you put out drink. The word is that the CIA knows that when Russians are in Moscow, they drink vodka. When they go to the West, they want single malt whiskey. So Pete has bought, or again, you and I have bought a tax for this Soviet spy. Pete's afraid he's going to get sloshed. When suddenly Yuri looks up to Pete and explains why he wanted this crash meeting. He announces that he had been involved working with the KGB to look into Lee Harvey Oswald before Oswald had defected and also after the assassination of President Kennedy. And he's read all the files and he can say without a scintilla of doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald was not working for the KGB. Pete hears this and he figures, this is great news. This is precisely what I want to hear. This is precisely what America wants to hear. This is precisely what the Warren Commission wants to find out. But as soon as he says this to himself, he realizes maybe it's a coincidence that I'm hearing exactly what I want to hear. Maybe they're telling me this because they know I want to hear it. And why are they telling me this? Because they know I want to hear it? Because it's not true. Because Lee Harvey Oswald had actually been working for the Russians. This is what one spy officer has called the wilderness of mirrors. You never know what's really true in this world of intelligence, and this is the world that Pete is living in. But the first thing he realizes now, he has to get Yuri back to the United States. They have to debrief him in great detail. So within a matter of days, he's back in a safe house in the horse country of Virginia, not too far from Washington, in the town of Middleburg, Virginia. And as Pete's interrogating him, and he's beginning to suspect Yuri is lying. He's not telling him the truth. And why is this? They want to get to the bottom of things because, you know, this is one of the most important questions in history. Did the Russians order the assassination of an American president? So the first thing that Pete and his CIA buddies decide to do is they want to make Yuri relax. They want him to think that he's being believed. So they send him off to Hawaii on a week's vacation. They send him off with a security guard and a redheaded prostitute that, again, you and I, the American taxpayers, are paying for. And Yuri goes on this fun vacation, and he comes back, and first thing they do when he comes back is they begin a harsh interrogation. They take him to a 12 by 12 cell, really. The CIA calls it a house, but it's really just a single room that's been built on the CIA training ground, Camp Perry in the woods. And they begin interrogating him for a year. It's a very harsh interrogation. Yuri is not allowed out of the room. He is, in many ways, you might say, that Pete is either a patriot determined to get the answer to this question, or he's a torturer. And this is the precursor of what's going to happen at Guantanamo Bay. But at this stage in my story, he becomes really a very complex character, an anti-hero in many ways. And Yuri, he doesn't break. He refuses to admit that he's lying. This is after a year. And finally, people within the CIA get on Yuri's side. And to this very day, the CIA is divided into people who believe that Yuri was sent here to spread disinformation, and others believe that he was telling the truth. The CIA to this day is divided between people who believe that Russia has been involved in a constant disinformation campaign to send false defectors to America, and those who believe that Russia was acting in good faith. And this is a drama that plays out today and plays out throughout the course of my book. The other element that spy novels have and that I needed in my real life story was romance. Now, Pete's a family man. He was married for 33 years to the same woman, and very happily so. But his daughter was a CIA agent also. And remember that man who was smuggled out in the box of farm machinery? Well, he's now is working for the CIA as an intelligence analyst. And he decides to set up a dinner for two young spies, for Pete's daughter and the son of a man who was one of Pete's antagonists in the agency. And this Operation Cupid is very successful. The two young spies meet within 8 months. There's a wedding. They get married by a lake in Virginia at a house owned by one of Pete's brothers, one of the admirals. And this romance and this family spy drama also resonates throughout my entire drama. Another element that every good spy story needs is a central mystery, something that George Smiley in the Le Carré books can go off to solve, or James Bond. The spy has to play detective. And I have found that I had a pretty good spy mystery that sent this entire tale into motion. It's October 1978 on the Chesapeake Bay. A sailboat goes aground, and the Coast Guard quickly boards the ship to investigate what went wrong. On the deck, the Coast Guard officers see 9mm bullets scattered about. They go down into the galley, and they see top secret papers stamped top secret, official business scattered all over the floor. It must have looked like the basement at Mar-a-Lago. And they also find a device which is still running. It's making noises. They later identify it as a burst transmitter. A burst transmitter is a spy tool that's used to send large amounts of information in sudden bursts to satellites circling the Earth to get them to the agencies quite quickly and covertly. They find all this, but they find no sign of the boat's owner. His name is John Paisley, and he's a high-ranking CIA official. There's just no sign of him. 10 days later, a body, despite being wrapped in 38 pounds of chains, manages to surface to the top of the Chesapeake Bay. The water and the fish and the eels in the bay have eaten this corpse beyond recognition. But the CIA quickly says, this is John Paisley. Well, is this possible? Could this be Paisley? The first thing you would do is look at his fingerprints. Only the CIA says, somehow, yes, we keep fingerprint records, but somehow we don't have John Paisley's fingerprint records. They somehow have vanished from our files. I used to give excuses like this when I was in high school, saying the dog had eaten my homework. But now the CIA was asking the American people to believe this. And they also come up with a very elaborate theory about how John Paisley committed suicide. The way they explain it is this. He goes up onto the deck of this sailboat. He wraps himself like a mummy in 38 pounds of chains. Then he trundles to the side of the boat. Then he manages to hurl himself into the air. And while wrapped in chains in the air, in his right hand, because he's right-handed, he holds a revolver and reaches across his body and shoots himself in the left ear. Well, he'd have to be quite an acrobat to accomplish a suicide in that manner, but I don't think even an acrobat would be as contorted enough as the CIA's explanation. What amazes many people is that the CIA is in the business of telling lies for so many decades, and yet they're still so bad at it. So who is this John Paisley? That's what Pete Begley decides to try to find out. And was this his body? And if it wasn't his body, where is John Paisley? And if it's not John Paisley, who is it? So the first thing Pete begins to find out about is what an important career Paisley had at the agency. He was involved in an operation called, for example, Gamma Guppy. Now that's not my name. This is what the CIA called the operation. That's their official code name. Gamma Guppy involved some rooms beneath the Kremlin. In the Kremlin wall, old stables have been used by the Russian political authorities as garages for the official limousines. And one of the people working in these garages was also working for the CIA. And each day, each morning, he would align the encrypted phone communications receivers to the same signal that was in alignment with an antenna on the roof of the Russian embassy in Moscow. And in this way, as the Russian bigwigs, the Politburo officials, drove around the city, we could eavesdrop on many of their conversations that they were making. We heard one official talking to his mistress, then giving his wife excuses about how he wouldn't be home that night. He had an official meeting. This is interesting, but not too important. Another one was getting lectured by his wife about all the weight he had gained. But finally, after a couple of months of listening, we had heard that the Soviets had a unique trick that they were going to use to fit a different sort of missile, a missile with larger capability, into the silos, and this would violate the disarmament missile treaty that we had forged with the Soviets. And Paisley was cognizant of this operation, and this sort of knowledge was very valuable to the Russians. So Pete now begins a quest to figure out who Paisley was and what had happened to him. And it's a quest that, coincidentally enough, involves all the different facets of his life as this mystery unspools. It involves the man he smuggled out in the farm machinery box. It involves his own family that had just gotten married, and it involves Yuri Nisenko. And this plays out throughout the whole book. But for a good spy novel to work, and for a true spy story to work, you need a payoff. And I had one. It's a snowy afternoon in Moscow in 2007. And Pete is standing there with a former KGB general outside a cemetery. And he learns something that reveals a continuum of treason that reaches from the Cold War into the present day in our intelligence services. And now that I have all these facts, all these different narrative balls I could juggle in the air, I sat down at this desk on this computer and I began to write. I wrote 2 deaths, each purportedly a suicide, each with its roots deep in the secret world, each with its own perplexing mysteries, wrenched Pete Begley, retired and somewhat besmirched spy, from the complacency of his pleasant exile and set him on the twisting path back to the shadowy battlefields of his previous life. As to what I wrote next, I hope I've intrigued you enough so that you'll pick up The Spy Who Knew Too Much and find out for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Everyone, if you have questions, please type them into the chat function. Do you ever feel that you know too many secrets and that you could be found wrapped in chains and in the water?
I owe too much money to anyone to get rid of me. No, I don't think so. I wish I knew more secrets.
Okay.
And I hope to find out more. I'm leaving on Saturday for Idaho. I'm covering the Idaho student murders for Graydon Carter. So I hope to find out something new, or at least get a story out of it.
Well, while we're waiting for people to perhaps write in the chat about the book, what is your feeling about the University of Idaho murders, where 4 students, for those who don't watch news incessantly like I do, were found stabbed to death very ferociously around, I think now 3 weeks ago? There doesn't seem to be a suspect, or
that's just so amazing that you could walk into a room, stab 4 people, and get away with it, and that 4 weeks could pass, and you have 40 FBI people, the Idaho State Police, and the local Moscow police in a college town, and no one seems to know anything. It's a real mystery. I'll probably get very cold trying to find an answer. There's a cold case, and it's very cold in Idaho this time of year.
Yeah, it's Moscow, Idaho. It's not Moscow, Russia. Do you have any feeling whether or not it was someone who stalked someone in particular?
I have no feelings whatsoever now. I'm going there with an open mind, and I'm going to see what I can find out. And I want to see what sort of job the police are doing. I want to see what the behavioral analysts are doing. I want to see if I can get, as I spoke about in The Spy Who Knew Too Much, part of the challenge in reporting and telling these tales is getting close enough to the principals so that you can get the story out of them. And it's not just a story of what they do, it's also their life, so they can become characters in this. And that's the challenge I'll face. And I don't know if I'll succeed or not, but I'll be, Hanukkah, I'll be in Idaho.
Do you think you're going to write a book about it?
I don't know. I'm hoping I can get this article done. We'll see, one step at a time. Hope I don't get pneumonia.
Is there anything else on your to-do list of a book that you're going to think about researching?
Well, I've been working not so much on a book. My book prior to this one was Night of the Assassins. It was a story, a true story about the Tehran conference where FDR, Churchill, and Stalin had met for the first time. And the Nazis sent in 38 paratroopers to try to kill them at this conference. And that story has been bought by Sony, and the producers are the guys who made the Homeland TV series. So I've been working with them for the past year to put together the script, and it's been actually a very fun exercise. The guys are very bright. They were two roommates from Princeton. The director is someone who went to Harvard. So it's a fun crowd to deal with.
Yeah, we had you speak on that book last year. I don't remember what month, but yes, it's an excellent, excellent book. I just want to remind everyone that it is The Spy Who Knew Too Much. And there are many other books. You can go to your local bookstore. We have Flashlight Book in Walnut Creek and Rakestraw in Danville. And there's also a Rinda bookstore. And Barnes & Noble has returned after several years of not being in Walnut Creek to our region. And so wherever you like to shop, whether it's online or in person, do pick up this book. It's a book that reads like a thriller, but is a true life, real life story. And we got a few comments that people are looking forward to it. So thank you so much, Howard. And
Thank you.
we look forward to your article about the University of Idaho murders and to the TV show when it's made. And when your next book comes out, keep us in mind because you're a delight. Thank you so much
Thank you.
to everyone.
Thank you for having me.
And early Chag Sameach for Hanukkah and to the new year, and be well, be safe. And oh yes, one more thing. The Jewish Community Center is a co-sponsor of the film Anton, which is streaming online now through Friday evening. It is a precursor, it's a film, a drama that shows the tensions between the Ukrainians and the Russians way back at the end of World War I, to give you an understanding a little bit of the tensions that we see now. It's called Anton. It's streaming eastbayjewishfilm.org. It's one of our year-round films. And next Monday, if you want to learn recipes about modern Jewish comfort food, go to underonetent.org. We all need some comfort food these days. Thank you. And everyone be well.